Good morning, people. Let's make an attempt to expand the conversation. I understand in the first video in this series that I laid a lot of stuff on you, attempting to explain a paradigm shift necessary in order to come into conversational relationship with the inner workings of one's existence. Okay? And that capacity is engendered by adopting a worldview that recognizes that rather than the self existing as a discrete entity with an assumed independent existence, it is seen otherwise as a experiential state of something else, some other underlying structure. Okay? This is a bigger deal than it might seem on the surface. Okay? It shouldn't be necessarily that contrary to our thinking to at least contemplate the idea that that might be the case. After all, none of us recoil at the notion that say perhaps taking various drugs or medicines do in fact modify our underlying biologic substrate such that they create changes in our experience of consciousness, but we are still burdened by a unsupported assumption that is part of our cultural heritage, that we believe the self exists in itself, of itself. And I'm here to suggest that that's probably a falsehood. It is something that is not supported by anything that would be evidential. Okay. Nonetheless, many of the practices that one finds around the world that people call spiritualism or some such are precisely investigations internally of a assumed self, a soul being that is assumed to exist and have some kind of eternal persistence. And there's a tremendous amount of time and effort spent by individuals trying to turn their eyes inwardly to discover whether or not there's something potent or magical or interesting or profound there. And you can work yourself up into some kind of strange headspaces by doing so. But it may be the case that there is nothing there to look at. It may not exist. It may be that the entire pursuit of understanding the self is trying to understand a phantasm. It could be that it's a complete waste of time. Now, if you contrast that view that's engendered by a simple unsupported assumption with the idea that you might choose to hold now, that that which you call yourself is an experience being had by something else, which is much easier to support, right? And again, we do not have to get into this in any kind of crazy woo sort of way. All we have to assume is that we are a biologic organism with biochemistry and a package of evolutionary heritage and internal drives and urges that is manifesting a experience that we recognize as selfhood. That's all you have to think right now, right? All you have to do is be open to the idea that you can modify the underlying substrate and it modifies the experience of self. It is something else that is having the experience. You are having, you identify with the experience, but you are not the thing creating it, right? All you have to do is to move into that latter headspace, and suddenly your entire interest changes. Because, of course, there's very little of consequence that is going to be found by turning eyes inward and studying that experience. It's worth a little bit of time, of course, but there is no expectation that anything of profundity will be found there because it's shallow. Certainly, if you understand that the self is an experience that is being had by something else, some underlying substrate, well, then suddenly your interest in the underlying substrate and how it works becomes radically more important. Now, I would caution you here, because if you start to get into the business of looking for guidance from other people, right, with an exception of what I'm telling you here, okay, you're going to find very quickly that if you start to investigate this underlying substrate, even if you start from the point of view of strict materialism and from a biological determinist point of view, you will find yourself on a path, okay? And a path that leads to at least the appearance of an existence of something that might be called panpsychism or such, okay? I'm not going to deny in any way that that path is there, because the simple reason being is that when you start to try to draw boundaries around what you want to call the underlying substrate, it becomes extremely difficult to know where to stop. I mean, you might be starting with, oh, just my biologic body, okay, but then you end up with the genome, and then you end up with life, and then you end up with the chemical structures and such that cause life, and then you end up in particle physics and everything, because you find that the underlying substrate is perhaps everything, okay? The path there does lead there, but a good magical practitioner is going to be very careful about running out to the end of that path straight away. There is no need to do so, okay? That may be worthy of interesting contemplation for sure, but if your interest is practical, meaning that you want to control the jabbering monkey mind and the basic urges that plague you in the day-to-day, if you want to have something that can stand in opposition to the onslaught of marketing, media, AI, and the rest, which is exploiting these tendencies within you for its own ends, if you want to be able to operate as an adept with practical ability here, it is essential that you remain within the authentic bounds of what you actually know. And none of us have a direct experience of any kind of panpsychism. You may have a direct experience of, within your own sphere of influence, the basic biologic urges that you can identify, constructs of consciousness that come from previous experience. You may be able to identify things that you were told in childhood or that your culture repeats to you. You may be able to incarnate those and resist those. And as you become more skillful, you may be able to expand that quite a way down this path. Authenticity is essential in this game, because if you're going to have a conversation with the monkey mind and tell it to quit beating you over the head with some urge that you wish it would stop, You're going to have that conversation in the language of that monkey mind somehow. That's the details of magic practice, in a manner that is authentic and convincing, otherwise it won't work. And if you jump all the way into panpsychism, you will end up in an abstraction, and the abstraction is of no use in convincing monkeys what to do. It's essential that you keep this in the kitchen and keep it absolutely personal and first person and in the context of what you have experienced. Okay? That's the point of effective practice. And if you do so, that sphere will expand and you will move further down this inevitable path. But it's a real mistake to rush to the end, because while that may be the destination, it's beyond our capacity to understand and utilize. And again, you can end up with a situation where you spend so much time contemplating that stuff in the abstract that you have nothing practical to show for it. Now, there's a second consequence that immediately emerges, too, when you start to consider this perspective that I'm sharing with you, that consciousness is an experience of something else, this underlying substrate. And that consequence is the sudden knowledge, in fact, that when you encounter other beings that appear to be conscious themselves, especially if you've gone to the point where you understand that the underlying substrate very likely extends just beyond, or much beyond, I guess, the individual meat bodies that might be engendering that consciousness. When you understand that the underlying substrate is far deeper than that, in fact, deeper than you expect, most likely. When you see other people, quote unquote, from this perspective, you understand that what they are doing is experiencing the underlying substrate too. Now, they may do it more or less constructively. It may be that certain kinds of more primal urges are expressed in their behavior than others. It may be that the level of consciousness that they exhibit is small, and the primal urges are a much larger proportion of what they're doing. But it becomes inescapable to assume that the basic experience that they are experiencing is the same as yours, and the underlying substrate that is engendering that base code that creates this phenomenon is identical to yours. Now, this doesn't mean that you necessarily have to turn the other cheek, but it does qualify one's understanding of the behavior of other people, recognizing that the motivations there may not be what you might have assumed if you assumed that these other people had selves that were discrete, independent, and in and of themselves. Okay. If everything that you encounter is an expression of an underlying universal substrate, it's a very different way of looking at the world, and a perception of ethical behavior, morals, and the rest that you might derive from that will be very different. And again, you're going to need to do that for yourself, because it needs to be real for you. but it'll be different than what you've been taught. Okay? And I think that you will find that it's markedly more constructive. In fact, if you go about that um, and you attempt to derive a idea of quote unquote moral behavior from the perspective of this way of looking at things, once you start to have a innate understanding of how the underlying substrate functions, and that becomes important to you, you see that the underlying substrate over time has a teleologic orientation towards ever expanding complexity, novelty, richer in terms of information saturation, and an ever broader expression of possible forms of being. Okay? It goes from simple to complex, um, inevitably. Okay? Unless there happen to be influences that spontaneously arise that um, contrast or destroy that process. All right. So if you are interested in the persistence of the underlying substrate so that you may be able to maintain your experience of consciousness longer, obviously you have a vested interest in the health of the underlying substrate. And you are much more interested in supporting it and advancing it than you are in preying upon it and destroying it. And for those who are not conscious, or minimally conscious, or only intermittently conscious, who are still captured in the dream world, believing that it's about themselves, well, then they are interested in capitalizing and destroying and exploiting the underlying process because they think it's all about themselves. That becomes a very, very simple principle-driven way of looking at the qualities of behaviors. If you understand that you are something else having an experience, you are interested in the advancement and the health of something else. Okay? If you think you are a self experiencing something else, then your tendency and your way of relating to it has a tendency to be much easier to be exploitive. Okay? This is an inevitable consequence of starting to walk down this path. And the consequences are interesting to contemplate. So that's about as much as I have time to talk at you with this morning. Got to go work in the shipyard. But hopefully that's wets your whistle a little bit and gives you some interest to start the process of contemplating along this line. Okay? Something to really think about. Do not make the mistake of just shrugging this material off as something that sounds weird, esoteric, or woo. I'm not kidding you that at least at some level, the society that we live in, while they may not call it magical practice, is utilizing these mechanisms to control your behavior. Now, you can call it marketing, you can call it whatever you want, but it's getting to be very, very good at it. And at least, and if you are not equally as adept, the ability to retain any kind of personal sovereignty in this world is going to be taken from you. It's incredibly serious. So as we go forward, more practically, I want to discuss the kinds of things that are necessary to build a personal framework by which you can advance these skills. But I want to hear what many of you think before I get into that, so that I can kind of tailor that information more concisely. Okay? Cheers. Have a good day.